Chapter 8 Pet Day. It felt like Pet Day would never come, but at last, the final day of the semester arrived. Mandy and James arranged to meet before school and take Blackie to the big day together. "Oh, look, there's Jill with Toto," Mandy said as she and James came through the school gates. Jill was carrying her tortoise in a small cardboard box with an air hole cut into it. Blackie was running around, twisting his leash around James's legs. "Heel," said James, pulling on the leash. Blackie looked up at him and sat down on James's feet. James sighed. "I don't think we'll ever be able to train him," he said. Mandy laughed. "Of course we will," she said. "He's only 4 months old." She looked up. "Here comes Jill." Jill waved and rushed over to them. "Look how well Toto looks, Mandy," she said. Then she saw Blackie. "Oh, James, he's gorgeous." Blackie stood up and wagged his tail so hard he nearly fell over. James swelled with pride. "I know," he said. "You'd never believe how much he's grown in the last few weeks. He was tiny when I first got him." "He still isn't as big as Licorice," said a voice behind them. Mandy turned around. Sarah was standing there with a coal-black Labrador puppy in her arms. "Hello, Licorice," Mandy said, tickling the puppy under the chin. "Look, Blackie," James said to his puppy. "That's your brother." Sarah looked at Blackie. "Your big brother," she said. Mandy looked from Blackie to the puppy in Sarah's arms. "I don't know about that," she said. "They look pretty much the same size to me." "And they're so alike," said Jill. "Don't get them mixed up. You wouldn't be able to tell them apart." "I would," said James. "I'd know Blackie anywhere." "And so would I," said Mandy. Sarah sniffed. "As if anybody could mistake my perfect little puppy for James's," she said, sweeping past them. "His was the runt of the litter." Mandy looked at James's face. "Don't pay any attention to her," Mandy said. "She's probably just jealous of Blackie's red collar and leash," said Jill. "Her puppy doesn't have a collar. She'll have to carry him everywhere." James looked more cheerful. "We've already started to train Blackie," he said. "Does he know any tricks?" asked Jill. "Not really," said James, "but he's still very young." Mandy smiled. That was better. Poor James had really looked upset before. Sarah was the kind of person that was hard to stand up to. "Come on," Mandy said. "Let's go and see everyone else's pet. I can't wait." Mandy looked around the classroom. The walls were covered with posters of animals. There was a big display in the corner with photographs of everyone's pets, and a table full of animal books. All around her, people were sitting with their animals in their cages or baskets or boxes. There was Jill and Toto, of course, then Peter with Timmy the terrier. There were several rabbits, 2 guinea pigs, 3 hamsters, and a parrot. There was a hedgehog, a gerbil, 2 cats, 4 kittens, and a canary, and Gary Roberts was giving a speech about snakes. Mandy was in heaven. "It'll be your turn soon," she whispered to James. James turned to her. "Our turn, you mean?" he said. "I'm not standing up in front of everyone alone. I'd be way too nervous." Mrs. Todd and Mrs. Black had joined their 2 classes together. Everyone who brought a pet was giving a little talk about taking care of their animals. Gary had a snake draped over his arm. He held it up to the class to see the pale yellow stripes on its greenish-black skin. "What does it eat?" asked Amy Fenton, holding on to the cage with her pet mouse in it. "Mostly worms and tadpoles," Gary said. Amy looked suspicious. "Not mice?" she asked. Gary shook his head. "No," he said. "Garter snakes don't eat mice." "And you're sure he isn't dangerous?" said Amy. "No, of course he isn't dangerous," Gary said to Amy. "He's a garter snake, not a python or cobra." "Amy is worried about Minnie," whispered Mandy, looking at Amy's mouse. James smiled. "She should look out for Richard Tanner's cat, then," he said. Mandy looked across the room at Duchess, Richard's enormous Persian cat. "She really suits her name," Mandy said as Duchess yawned and gazed around the classroom as if she owned it. "Thank you, Gary," Mrs. Todd said as he went to sit down. "Now, I see we have 2 little puppies here today." She smiled at James and Sarah. "Who's going first?" she asked. "I will," said Sarah eagerly. "I want to show you what Licorice can do." Sarah carried Licorice out to the front of the class and put him down on the floor. "Sit," she instructed the puppy. The puppy gave a short bark and wagged his tail. He didn't make the slightest move to sit. "See," said Mandy, "Blackie isn't the only disobedient one." "Sit," Sarah said again to Licorice. Licorice lay down and rolled over to have his tummy tickled. "Oh, he's so cute," said Amy Fenton. Sarah looked around the class. "He can do it," she said. "He can sit when I tell him. Sit, Licorice." Mrs. Todd smiled. "I'm sure he can do it, Sarah," she said, "but he's probably too excited with all the other animals here today." Sarah looked really upset. She bent to pick Licorice up. Mandy felt sorry for her. "Blackie is the same way," she said. "That's right," said James. "He does just as he likes, whatever we say." Sarah looked around. "Does he?" she said. "Really?" "You bet," said James. "Tell everyone about the pastries," said Mandy. "Yes, tell us about the pastries, James," said Mrs. Black. "That sounds interesting." James stood up and told the story about Blackie and the cream pastries. Mandy looked at him, amazed. Usually James was quite shy, but soon as he had the whole class laughing, even Sarah cheered up. "I thought you were too nervous to talk to the class," Mandy whispered as he sat down. James blushed. "I was," he said, "but I forgot all about that when I started talking about Blackie." The bell rang for the end of school, and everyone groaned. "My goodness," said Mrs. Todd, "I've never seen you all so disappointed that it was time to go home, especially on the last day of school." "Maybe we should do this more often," Mrs. Black suggested. "Oh, can we, please?" said Mandy. Mrs. Todd looked at her. "You would have animals in the classroom every day if you could, Mandy," she said. Mandy nodded. "That's right," she said. "This is the best day I've ever had at school." James almost had to drag Mandy away. "Oh, just a moment," she said. "I haven't said hello to Carrie's parrot. He was really sick last year. Just look at him now." James shook his head. "Do you know all the animals here?" he said. Mandy turned to him in surprise. "Yes, I suppose I do," she said. She smiled. "You're right, James. I know them all. Each one has been to Animal Ark at one time or another." James grinned at her. "You got more animal friends than anybody I know," he said. Mandy nodded, her eyes shining. "I may not have a pet of my own," she said, "but I've got a whole village full of animal friends." In a way, she was lucky. Her friends might each have a pet, but she had lots of animals to care for. "You know, James," she said, "I don't think I'd mind not having a pet." James laughed as Timmy, Peter's Cairn Terrier, ran across the playground and jumped up on Mandy's legs. "Everyone else's pet comes to you," he said. "Oh, Timmy," said Mandy, bending down to pet the little dog. James clipped on Blackie's leash and adjusted his collar. Then he pointed a finger at the little puppy. "Heel," he said. Blackie put his head on one side and looked at James curiously. Mandy giggled. "Isn't he adorable?" she said. James grinned. "Yes, he is," he said, "but he isn't very obedient." Timmy walked over to Blackie and gave a sharp little bark. Blackie backed away. James held onto his leash. "Timmy is only trying to make friends, Blackie," James said to his puppy. Blackie looked at the other dog. Then he took a step forward and nudged the terrier with his nose. Timmy sniffed gently and laid a paw on Blackie's back. Blackie growled softly and butted Timmy playfully. "There," said Mandy. "They're playing." There was a shout from the other side of the playground, and Mandy turned to look. "My rabbit! Catch him quickly!" a small girl shouted. "Oh no," said James. "Laura Baker's rabbit has run away." Timmy the terrier gave a short, sharp bark and shot out of Mandy's reach. He raced across the playground, heading straight for the rabbit. "Oh no," said James. He cupped both hands around his mouth. "Timmy!" he called. "James!" said Mandy. "Watch out!" But it was too late. James had let go of Blackie's leash, and the little puppy was off across the playground before Mandy or James could catch him. The leash trailed behind him as he ran after his new friend. Blackie thought it was a game. "Oh no," said James. "Quick! After him, Mandy!"